Welcome back to Rules of Engagement. This is the second episode of Developing Fundamentals. The first episode was last Tuesday. If you care to develop some of those fundamentals, you can go back and check out the VODs at mlg.tv, and of course there's all my other episodes there as well. We just went over some of the economic basics, I guess we can call economic basics part 2 because part 1 was last week. Now we're about to start the micro basics part 2, but before we get ahead with that, I'd like to remind you guys, if you have any replays you want me to go over on Thursday's episode, the community critique, please send those over. There's a forum at majorleaguegaming.com/replays. It's a pretty painless form, about 20 seconds. Go over there, send me your replays, and again, of course, also tweet me any questions you have at isaxlev. We'll get to the Q&A section of the show at the end of this episode. But let's just jump into our micro concepts part 2. So a couple of things to keep in mind about the micro concepts is, one, today we're going to talk about thinking position. This is about army control, not single unit control. So you want to make sure your army is positioned where it does your army the most service. Next thing is be thinking ahead. What thinking ahead means is it means you should know roughly what unit composition your opponent has, which means you should know roughly what type of micro you're going to want to focus on in the battle. We'll cover a little more, a couple examples of that later on. Then the last part, we're going to talk about tricks to improve your micro and just make sure you're not making any horrible micro blunders or anything like that. So let's get right into this game here I made. And we're going to start off with basically talking about position, right? So when you're thinking position, the most important thing to think about is, does your army have more range damage than your opponent's army? Range damage includes things like infestors with fungal growth. It includes things like High Templar with Storm, Colossi, etc. A very simple example we're going to go to right here is Marines versus Zerglings. A pure Marine composition obviously has more range damage than a pure Zergling composition because Zerglings are melee units and Marines are ranged. So it can get a little more complex later down the road. We can cover those in future episodes, but for now, if you're Marines, you have a more range in your competition than your opponent. So your position, you want to have less service area. So we're going to look at one quick battle. This is what happens if you engage Marines versus Zerglings, right, in the open. In the open, what's going to happen, this is 10 Marines right here versus 20 Zerglings. So it's cost for cost exactly even, right? Exactly even in food and cost, basically everything. Zerglings versus Marines in the open. What happens is the Zerglings can attack the Marines from all sides, and they will pretty much win that 9 times out of 10. Just a few Zerglings left over, right? That's the perfect position for the Zergling player. So if you have less range in your opponent, you want to fight where there's the most service area possible. Now let's say you're on the side where you have the greater range attack than your opponent. What you want to do is you want to prevent service area. So if you hide in a corner, all of a sudden there's much less service area. And now when the Zerglings try to engage the Marines, all of a sudden it's a totally different situation with the Marines coming out significantly on top. As you can see here, there's still 7 Marines left. They only lost 3 Marines, where fighting the battle the other way, you lost 10. That's like 300% more efficient at the end of the battle, which is pretty cool. So we're going to take a look at a couple different ways to position your army if you have more range than your opponent, right? We're going to fast forward just a bit to get to this point. And here's basically 3 different types of structures. We have to, let me move this a little bit more centered here. Okay, there we go. So we can see here we have units. In the first battle, we saw the units were right here. And when the Zerglings engaged them, they had all this surface area right here. So the Zerglings could attack the Marines from many different angles. On the second battle, we had the Marines up here, and the Zerglings could only attack them from this amount of position. Okay? So it's a radically different situation there. It's almost, if you just try to like use your basic little math geometry, you take some fingers here and you can say, well, about 4 times more Zerglings could engage the Marines in this situation than in the other one, roughly. Which means you're taking 4 times more damage. And that's a lot of extra damage, and we saw the effectiveness of that when we did that quick replay. Of course, this position is like super ideal, this is super unideal, and there's those kind of middle ground spots where right here, the Zerglings can kind of get a decent amount of service area, but not quite the max. So it's a kind of a jockeying for a position battle. Of course, you can't always fight in the ideal spot, but keep in mind that's where you want to engage if you have more range in your army than your opponent. The next thing we're going to talk about is thinking ahead in the battle. So we're going to jump over back to this game, and we're going to take a look at another different position that could happen. Let's fast forward it just a bit here. And let's say you're a Protoss player, and you have an army like this. This is a fairly standard battleground on most maps to engage in an area about this open, right? In this situation, the Terran army is a little bit stronger than the Protoss army, but not by that much in resource value. But if you know you have your basic, Colossi, Zealot, Stalker, Sentry composition from the Protoss, you know your Terran opponent is going to have Vikings, Medivacs, Marines, Marauders, Viking Medivacs. You should already know what type of micro you want to do. In this position, the micro you want to do is just going to be, you're going to want to trap the Marines so they can't kite. You want to make sure you have Guardian Shield up. That's the two most important things. If you have extra, abilities to control units after that, you're going to want to try to focus down Vikings with Stalkers, and then also try to focus your Colossi on the largest groups of Bile. But those two things are more minor. The two most important things are Guardian Shield and Trap with Force Field. So going into the battle, you should already know instantly the two most important things. And then the third most important thing is going to be the macro behind that in the real game. Keep your production going and all that stuff in the background. Of course, in a little bit of a micro battle like this, you don't have to do that, but that's something to keep in mind for a real game. Where does that prioritize? Like, what elements of micro are more important than keeping up your macro and which aren't? And there's almost never more than one or two aspects of micro that are more important than your macro. So as long as you know what you're doing ahead of time, even if you're not super fast, we're going to take a look at this battle right here. What's going to happen is, as long as you can kind of anticipate what you should be doing, you should be able to do it relatively efficiently. So right here, it's not super fast, just one Guardian Shield, a couple of Force Fields, very, not very fast or super crazy, just so most of the Bile couldn't run away. And that's something that is not super hard to do, but it's just about knowing what you should be doing, and that's about thinking ahead. Knowing it's going to be this composition versus that composition. This is the type of micro that's very important, and you need to focus on this type of micro. So that's something that is different with every composition, and that's something we can go into. We can talk about how to improve in that regard later on the road. We're going to do one more example really quick here, and this is going to be, again, if you have siege tanks and Marines, right? Pretty common composition: siege tanks, Marines, and Medivacs. And you're fighting an opponent who has Speedling, Baneling, and Speed Baneling, Speed Zergling, and Mutas, which is a very common Terran versus Zerg situation. You should know what micro to prioritize, right? So in the battle, you want to run away your Marines when in doubt, and then focus down the Banelings. There's more advanced ways to micro this, where you split Marines and then they can all fight, and it's a little bit more effective. But when in doubt, if you don't feel confident in your ability to split Marines very well, just run them behind the tanks when the Banelings run in, and then make sure the tanks are focusing the Banelings here. So if you grab the tanks here, you're going to see the micro you want to do is you want to start shift right-clicking all these Banelings, right? See these little red arrows are shift right-click attack commands, where you just double-click your tanks, hold down shift, right-click a bunch of Banelings there. And that means they'll shoot the Banelings and not all these Zerglings here, and your Marines can deal with the Zerglings. And you should be able to mop this battle up without too much of a problem here. And a pretty convincing win. So that's all about just knowing what you need to be microing ahead of time. And then, of course, sometimes this doesn't happen, right? Sometimes you're not sure how you should micro, and even if you know 5 minutes before the battle what type of units are going to be in there, you still know the answer. So if you're ever in doubt, just attack move. As long as you attack move, and it's better than doing micro that's suboptimal. So never do a micro technique because you think it might help your units. Only do it if you know it will, and if you don't know what to do, just attack move. This wasn't quite a perfect attack move. I moved the guys back a bit there. But if you attack move, things won't go horribly wrong. It's pretty hard to screw up with attack move. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And then the last thing we talked about is when you're microing, you want to think ahead and know what type of micro you should be doing. That might not happen. Let's say you have this giant army, they have this giant army, you have no idea. Even with 5 minutes 5 minutes knowing before it happens what the army is going to be like, how to control that. So that's where you do the attack move, make sure nothing horribly wrong goes on, and then after the game you check out the replay. You think, or you don't have to check out the replay. You can just think about it. You do like a post-mortem on what happened that game. So you'll say, okay, he had this unit size, I had these amount of units. Which of my units I want to attack? What's the best positioning to battle? What spells should I be using? And it might take you half an hour to try to figure it out, or you might not even figure out exactly the best way to control that battle. Then you can go into a pro game and watch how they controlled it. and you can kind of see what they did and take little bits from them. So when in doubt, just attack move and do a post-mortem afterwards. And then the next game, you're going to have that knowledge. You're like, oh, out of this general competition, he has this general type of competition. I know I want to be doing these type of techniques. And if you know what techniques you want to do ahead of time, it makes the micro much, much easier to perform. So that's basically all the micro concepts we're going to cover today. Let's go over a quick recap of what we learned. The most important things were to think position, right? No, if you have more range in your army, you want less surface area. If you have less range damage, you want more surface area. Then you got to think ahead, so you know what type of micro techniques to do. The best way you can do that is if you know you know what competitions are going to be involved on either side of the conflict, and then you should have a little like notepad or just in your head know the micro techniques that you should do for every competition versus competition type of battle. Then the next thing is the tricks to improve micro. When in doubt, attack move, and then what really improves the micro is going to be that post-mortem analysis of your own battle. So you take a look at that battle and you say, okay, I need to work on this technique. This one aspect of the battle went horribly wrong. My storms were all terrible. My force fields were all terrible. Then you know what to focus on, and as long as you know what to focus on, you'll actually find yourself getting better at it even without doing anything special. It will ground into your subconscious to kind of like put more attention to that during the game. So just make sure you know what type of micro you need to focus on, and you'll find yourself getting better at it. So thanks for watching this segment on micro concepts. We're going to take a quick break. Then we're going to get on to segment 3, which is going to be build order concepts part 2.